want to some extent, follow on from what we've just been talking about, but I want to suggest that there is something that I really think we ought to do, which will actually cost a fair amount of money, and is to do with Corpora. And it's this idea of having corpora which are individuated, so that we know what an individual speaker hears and says, as opposed to these very large, huge text corpora we have, which are this huge schmooze of information from all over the place, where we very rarely get to know what an individual person was saying or hearing. And there's some absolutely basic things that we don't know because we don't have this resource. There is no good estimate for how many words an average individual speaks and writes in a day. You can see all sorts of numbers on the web. They appear to have been made up with really no information. You'll see all sorts of things like women say more than men. We don't know whether it's true or not. Probably is rubbish, but we don't know. We don't know how many words an individual hears and reads each day. We don't know whether it's 50,000 or 100,000. We don't know the variation. We don't know how that might vary depending on your age. We don't know how much of our speech and language production is in different modalities. We don't know how much people are talking on mobiles. We don't know how much you're typing an email or on Facebook and so on. There's all sorts of very basic things we don't know because we don't track an individual's language use. We don't know things about language use by bi- and trilingual speakers. Typically, you're going to switch between languages. We don't know how people do that. We don't know much about variation between speakers. We don't know about vocabulary effects of previous discourse. I mean, we know in theory that if somebody starts using a word, then the other person will pick it up and use it, but we don't really know how often that happens. We don't know about variation according to the modality with which an individual's speaking. We don't know very much about register differences. We crucially don't know about negotiation of meaning between speakers. When we get a very large text corpus, we have words from every speaker with every possible use, but that's not actually realistic in terms of what an individual understands by a meaning of a word, I believe. So if we're actually going to sort of do serious scientific investigation of this, we need to have sometimes called longitudinal corpora. We need to have corpora collected from individual speakers. And if we did that, then we could work on the sort of things in syntax. Maybe we'd be interested in like speaker variation. I mean, for instance, when you build a large grammar, you put in all the subcategorization variants for all the verbs. Maybe that some of those things just go in groups, and we don't know. I think that in order to use distributional semantics properly, I would really like a corpus that was adjusted for individual use. As I say, I think that what happens is that if you do something like take the Google Ngram corpus, then you get this very crude sort of overview-y thing, which doesn't reflect the way that an individual will use a word, and that's absolutely crucial in terms of understanding how meaning is working, because meaning is negotiated between two people. We don't know very much about technology use in terms of, where people are getting their vocabulary from. We don't know about, whether we're mostly getting things from television or radio or email or whatever. And there's a whole load of things that this sort of corpus would support in terms of interdisciplinary work and sociological studies and so on. So, could we do this? Could we build large-scale corpora based on an individual's an individual's language production and what they're actually hearing, and could we do it for 23 languages? And I think we could, and I think it would be fairly expensive, but not inconceivably so. The technology is more or less there. We need to talk about spoken language and reading and writing, but we have now got very small head cams that are available. There are devices that could, for instance, attach to one's glasses in order to do the sort of acquisition of stuff that's coming by the visual channel. We could, of course, talk about logging from computers and other devices, although that causes huge amounts of problems itself. And we could think about doing things like OCR and speech recognition as input to human transcription and annotation. There's a big issue about the sort of legal and ethical problems with doing this. I have this horrible feeling that if we ever did have a project to do this, then half of the money would go to the lawyers. But there's well-known sort of issues that we could investigate. I mean, when you are logging data, you always allow people to have off buttons. There's work on automatic anonymization. So you could imagine transcription, human transcription with semi-automatic anonymization. There's a whole set of things, of possible technological solutions to those sort of problems. This would, of course, require a lot of work before we actually tried to do any sort of large-scale rollout. But I do seriously believe that in order to really understand language use and to get some way, perhaps, towards the sort of grounding issues that Martin was talking about, we need something like this. It is no use just working on very, very large text corpora. We do need to understand how individuals are working. So that was that. That was all I wanted to say.
So looking at the individual text corpora, that is and Copestake's, but that's not the dream.
Not just text.
No,
everything.
Corpora. Yeah, everything.
Everything.
Speech, vision, everything.
Yes, with a lot of people.
With a lot of people.
With a lot of people, with a lot of languages, with lots of different ages and so on. So that we really do understand how ordinary people are using language in everyday situations.
Just a question. Maybe you have said it, but I didn't hear it. And it could be that some of the subjects in this gathering task are even ones that communicate with each other,
yes.
so that you get communication situation.
Yes. Sorry, I didn't. I meant to say that and didn't. But yes, he'd want to do that.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say I think this proposal complements the one that I made very strongly. In fact, it seems to me that if this proposal were to start to take shape, then the data that the robotics builders would want to use would come from it.
Yes.
Just a quick, can you hear me? Quick comment. Something like this has already been doing, especially people from the ubiquitous computing community. They're actually starting using cellular phone, giving them to people for a month and tracking all their behavior, to the extent that it is possible to track behavior by means of cellular phones. They're using accelerometers, of course recording their spoken language, sometimes also recording SMS, etc. There are some quite interesting work in this respect, and they can be framed in the general idea of getting at behavior, general behavior of people, and of course language is one part of that. And you might find some good references around. I mean, not in the broader perspective that you were talking about, but something like that is starting emerging.
Yes, that's true. And I mean, some of my colleagues in Cambridge are involved, for instance, in the computer laboratory in Cambridge, are involved in instrumenting people as they work in scientific laboratories, and they are therefore involved in some of the technology that we would need to do this sort of thing. But I still think there's a need to do much more than is currently going on, and that I'm aware of that's currently going on. But yes.
Can you raise up? We said it's much better for the movie.
So Peter Helwig, Heidelberg again. I'm not quite understand what you mean with individual. I mean, if individual is an individual person, we have 80 million persons in Germany who speak German, and of course every individual will use the language differently. It depends of his school, of the situation, and so on. In your talk, you sometimes said ordinary people, but that's already, I think, an abstraction, and then I do not quite see the difference between huge corpus. I see it different, what Corpora could help us. I mean, Chomsky defined grammar, or more broadly, the competence of a human speaker to produce, to generate an infinite number of grammatical sentences. So for me, the individual would only be an example. I am interested in individuals only as examples of this general faculty of generating everything which is acceptable in a situation, to put it on a broader scale.
So what we have at the moment are a very large text corpora where we typically cannot track the individual. And so, I mean, yes, obviously any experiment of this type would involve sampling people, and even if we talk about hundreds of individuals, that's not going to cover the entire variability. But I mean, the very first thing that I would want to do is to take a relatively small number of people and see what individual variation we got, and how an individual's vocabulary use or whatever compared to a text corpus. I'm reasonably certain, for instance, that if you look at distributional techniques, distributional semantics techniques, that what we're seeing in the large text corpora don't reflect what an individual would be saying, and certainly don't reflect what an individual will be hearing, and certainly don't reflect what an individual will be saying, so that my use of a particular word will be subtly different from another British English speaker, even of one of the same background. And that because we're looking at corpora where all of those things have been put together in a way where we cannot reconstruct what the individuals were doing, we're missing that. So I don't want to go too much into details, but I mean, what you find when you empirically investigate things like this is that you get it seems to me that we get a lack of precision from looking at these very large corpora that arises because we are not allowing for the individual variation. That in some sense my own internal ideas of how a particular word works vary from another person's in an interesting way. When I talk to that other person, we negotiate the meaning. I mean, I'm going back to sort of ideas that were around in the 70s. Jeff Numberg was talking about things like the meaning of jazz or something like that. When we talk to an individual person, we negotiate the meaning of that we're using a particular term in. So Jeff talked about, what do you include in jazz? What particular subgenres of music do you include in jazz? That aspect of language use is completely lost when you are looking at a large text corpus, because it has every possible individual's use of a term like jazz in there. And that's unrealistic. That's not actually how I would use the term, or how any other individual would use the term. When we talk to people, we do this sort of subtle shift in meaning, this subtle adaptation in meaning. And I think that's a sort of crucial part of language understanding, which we just cannot get out of the existing corpora, I think. So that's just one thing, though. I mean, that's my particular obsession with the semantics. But all of these other things about exactly how the discourse is working, how, you know, we have reasonably large corpora with discourses, but they're all terribly artificial. There's a huge number of things we just don't know about language use, and which we can only do if we actually start this, as I say, individuation and possibly more situation of the language.
It's not a direct response to Ant's point, but I think it's sort of like we're trying to abstract away a little bit from the discussions. I think one of the things that's coming out is sort of like an interesting tension between engineering and basic science. And in an ideal world, they should sort of like strengthen each other. You make progress in basic science, you get progress in engineering, you get ideas from engineering that feed back into basic science. But that's not always the case. Like, for example, take sort of like, you know, something that's at the basis of what we all do. That's mathematics, I think, to a large extent. Because at some stage you kind of like have to translate it into numbers. Now, there's lots of problems in number theory that are completely unsolved. And that's really basic science, but that doesn't prevent us from using mathematics and doing that very, very successfully. And maybe there's sort of like a similar situation in linguistics and natural language processing as well. I don't know. But I think, you know, if it might be, again, sort of like an area that we want to look at if we want to sort of like, you know, coordinate research in Europe, or sort of like have a grand challenge or a big theme.
Sorry, I don't know whether I was supposed to respond to that, but yeah, sure. I mean, I think I don't see engineering and theory as at all separate from each other. I always, you know, I really think that the technology and the theory and language processing go very, very much together, and I'm not even sure that I can separate them.
Just to elaborate a little bit more on that, I'm trying to broaden the perspective a little bit more. So I think that this proposal is very interesting because it also goes quite a lot beyond language per se. So, but using language, you can, and trying to extract significant patterns and regularities in language used by single individuals, you can get a number of different characterization of those individuals, say by extracting personality traits, general dispositions, and all this is useful in process. Well, first of all, in understanding humans in general. Secondly, it's useful technologically because it gives you a hunch towards behavior explanation and behavior prediction. By analyzing the language of people, you can, I mean, it is well known that, for instance, the extroverts people tend to use more content words than introverts people. That the speech rate of extroverts people is much higher than that of introverts. Then you can have different kinds. You can use different kinds of characterization. The utility from the technological point of view of this characterization is the fact that when you know that a person is, say, an extrovert or a neurotic, then you can start trying to predict or explain the behavior. Still, you know, broadly speaking, but it's something that at present you can only do in certain cases by only analyzing large amount of corpora. Whereas, on the other hand, something that can be a way to use your proposal is to extract high-level characterization of individuals in order then to be able to explain and predict their behavior, not only the verbal one.
I mean, I guess there's a couple of things that I would have said if I had a bit more, if I was trying to talk about this in detail, but I also think that doing something of this type would be very useful for aids for people with disabilities, for instance, that if you have a model of individual language use, I mean, this is something I worked on years ago, that you can then have a better model of prediction, which is useful under many circumstances. But also the sort of technology which we would need in order to acquire this sort of data in a convenient fashion, a large-scale fashion, would be directly useful for these sort of memory-based systems where you're actually trying to help people with sort of various types of cognitive disability. That if you actually know how to wire people up efficiently so that and do decent speech recognition, then that's actually something that could be immensely beneficial for many people in their day-to-day lives. Actually, and me too, never mind people with disabilities. Anyway.
Okay. Well, there's one example of a database which contains exactly the kind of data you have in mind, or at least that's my question, whether it's the kind of data you have in mind. That's the child's database, which is highly natural, adult-child interaction. It contains a lot of meaning negotiation parts between the child and the caregiver. And the question is it that what you have in mind, or what do you want in addition to it?
Well, I wanted to do this with adults. Children aren't reading in childers. I mean, they're typically up to the age of 4 or something. So you're getting some of their interactions with the adults. You're not actually getting their entire interactions. So yes, but something of that order where you can talk about an individual person. For the sake of this type of thing, you wouldn't actually need to wire up one person for 10 years or whatever, because we're assuming that their language use adults' language use isn't going to change that much. It would be sufficient to wire up a lot of people for a week or a month or something. But in terms of the actual sort of data acquisition, yes, the sort of childish thing is exactly what I have in mind. But for adults, knowing about written sources of input and email and web use and television and radio. Well, I mean, television and radio isn't in childers, it's just the directed interactions, so those sort of things are missing, and that might actually be quite significant even when you're talking about just child language acquisition. So I have in mind more a much more comprehensive. The aim would be to get absolutely everything that person heard and absolutely everything that person said over a course of a time period of a week or more.
I mean,
Please stand up. That would be nice.
Okay, so I mean, people who want to do this kind of research have started from YouTube. So you have a lot of actually groups working on YouTube data, which basically gives you the variation and gives you also silly language sometimes, which is what people also want to study. So it's a kind of, it's a kind of starting point basically, and I think that.
I mean, there are all these things where you could get this sort of some of what I'm after, but I think the actual comprehensiveness of what I'm talking about is really crucial. I mean, at least I think it might be crucial. I mean, one thing that one could do is do a pilot project of this type where you did log somebody's complete language use and then see how different it was from the sorts of things you were getting off YouTube, and find if what you got off YouTube or a social network site or whatever it was, good enough, then we don't need to go away and wire up, lots of people from lots of languages. But I think in order to get the proper situation working and to get a proper cross-section of people, I mean, I really think that we don't want to just be focusing on the sort of 20-ish-year-old technologically obsessed guys, because we've done far too much work already on 20-odd-year-old technologically obsessed guys. I mean, that's the YouTube population is not a representative sample.
Moscow. I have a question, if you don't mind. Well, actually, there have been attempts to somehow restrict the collection of corpora toward one or another aspect of activity. For instance, I know that in St. Petersburg in Russia, there was a collection of speech production done in one day. It was called something like One Speech Day, where thousands of people were recorded on trams, buses, the underground and everything, discussing things from 0 to 24 hours on a particular day. I understand that. I also understand what you are saying about individual corpora, meaning that meanings are negotiated between individual persons. My question would be, I just cannot understand what linguistic insights can we hope to gather from these individual corpora. Suppose we will know that, for instance, one person understands some subtle meaning of a verb or whatever from another person. Let's take some close items like scorn or despise or contempt. We will see that one individual understands these concepts a little different from other ones. But are we able to extrapolate this and get some really linguistic insights on that? This is what I just cannot see. Of course, I understand that it would be good for this individual to have this record as a sort of a blood test to see how he behaves. But in general, for linguistics, what can we expect to find out?
I don't think that the interest is in particular words as such. It's in the interest is in the degree of variability that you might expect to get over the vocabulary, and to find out what that is, and then to see how that relates to the sort of average corpus use, and ideally to see whether we can track this sort of idea of meaning negotiation and meaning variation and so on. So it's not that I want to find out exactly how a particular word like scorn or whatever is used. I want to find out, whether my hunch about individual variation is true, which I don't know, and to find out about whether we can, what sort of models we would use of that, and crucially, what this sort of process of negotiating meaning between humans amounts to, and whether we could actually observe that. And I think, to be honest, my sort of dream of the way that semantics goes, that's absolutely crucial, that we not say there is one meaning out there, but that we end up in a situation where we can actually model the negotiation of meaning that goes on in a conversation.
But I think you could even give a stronger answer. When we try to confirm certain hypotheses on word order, on word order effects, then it turns out that the data you measure in German corpora do not really fully match any individual theory or grammar, and there's a very simple reason for that, and that is that Northern and German speakers are mixed together. And when you get them statistically mixed, what comes out is nobody's grammar. Nobody's. And if you try to induce it, because there are simply different degrees of order freedom in certain variants of the language. And I guess the same thing would carry over to other parts of soft constraints in grammar. And in semantics, almost everything is soft, so it would also carry over to most parts of semantics. So I guess really that if you really try to do language induction, grammar induction, semantics induction from Corpora, individuation could really help you quite a bit in order to deal with these data.
Yes, I mean, my hunch is that it's absolutely essential that we cannot create a proper model for semantics from a general text corpus. We need an individuated corpus to do it. Anyway.
All right.
Gotta go now.